Greetings. My name is Diana Tsifopoulos Honey. 2021 represents the bicentennial year from the outbreak of the Greek War of Independence. This presentation was originally part of a commemorative event presented on March 25th, 2021. Typically, these annual events talk about the key events of the war, different people that were significant to its execution, and focus primarily on the plight of the Greek people during the war. However, I decided to take a slightly different perspective. This particular topic isn't typically discussed, and if it's given any kind of attention, it's usually just tangential. My approach is transnational, since I feel I have a foot on each side of the Atlantic. You see, my parents were immigrants from Greece, and they instilled in me a love for Greece, a love for my Greek heritage, my Greek culture, and the Greek Orthodox faith. But they came here pursuing an American dream. I chose the image that you see before you because it underlies one of the overarching reasons why there was American and international interest in the Greek War of Independence. In America during the 18th century and into the 19th century, there was a resurgence of interest in the classics, and specifically the Golden Age of Greece, as a symbol of democratic thought and intellectualism. Here I will focus on American perceptions, American interest, and actually an American political conundrum that was taking place during this time in the halls of Congress and in the White House. The interest of the American public can be more easily expressed than that of the political aspects. In March of 1821, the United States was a 45-year-old burgeoning republic. James Monroe was the nation's 5th president, having just celebrated his 2nd inauguration on March 4th, 1821. He was faced with a tremendous debt that still existed from the Revolutionary War, as well as the many issues which were part of the growing nation's agenda. The map which I have included here illustrates what the young nation looked like in 1821. Expansion was a big issue. Direct appeals to Congress for support and funding of the Greek War were sidelined by a domestic environment that saw huge unemployment, distrust of banking, and a tremendous mistrust in paper money. Hence the trade agreements which emerged with England, France, Russia, and even to some extent with the Ottoman Empire were viewed as crucial to the economic survival of the United States. But as Americans watched the Greeks being slaughtered by the Turks, they were moved. This was viewed as a crime against a Christian people. While Americans were predominantly Protestant, they saw the Greeks as religious kin. So any support of the Greeks was seen as an effort to free a Christian people from the bondage of this non-Christian oppressor. The Greeks were also viewed through the lens of the glory of ancient Greece and the gifts of that culture which Americans themselves had received. These were the descendants of Homer, of Plato, Pythagoras, Demosthenes, Hippocrates, to name a few from a wide range of ancient Greek contributors to the development of American society, culture, and civilization. At the same time, the United States was essentially fresh from their own war against what was viewed as political bondage to England. The lack of representation in Parliament, the ever-increasing demands both in terms of economic means, but also the lack of freedom and self-determination, this made the Greek struggle more real, more personal. Supporting the Greeks made absolute sense. Along with the emphasis on classical studies at the time, there was also in America a resurgence of architectural styles reflecting Greek architecture. This neoclassical Greek revival is apparent in the construction of many buildings and even homes from this time throughout the United States. You can see in the illustrations here the elements of Greek architecture with the Ionic and Doric columns used in the facades of banks, homes, and even federal buildings. The naming of cities in the United States also reflected this appreciation for the legacy of Greece. I have a small sampling here of just a few of the cities with Greek names. Athens in Georgia, Alabama, Tennessee, and Ohio. Ithaca, New York, and many others. Greece, New York, was established in 1822, the year after the outbreak of the Greek War. And this was done to honor the Greek struggle as the whole world followed closely the events of the War of Independence. Ypsilanti, Michigan is probably one of the most famous Greek-named cities in the U.S. It was renamed Ypsilanti in 1825 in the midst of the Greek Revolution, and that was done to honor the contributions to the Greek War of Independence by the famous Ypsilanti family. Additional aspects of American support came in a variety of different forms, such as the many Greek committees whose focus was on aiding the Greek cause. The largest of these committees were formed in the major cities of the time, New York, Boston, and Philadelphia. They were headed by notable individuals from within these communities whose efforts were for fundraising and material support. The roots of the formation of these committees stems from an appeal sent in May of 1821 by the Messenian Senate of Kalamata to the United States, asking that America hearken back to its revolutionary roots and aid the Greek cause. This appeal was sent through Albert Gallatin to John Quincy Adams from Paris. At the same time, there was correspondence between Thomas Jefferson and Adamantius Corais, who appealed to the now retiring and aging elder statesman for his influence on the U.S. Congress to send aid, military support, and if not those, at least for his influence in the establishment of a Greek state in the style of the American Republic. A copy of the letter to Jefferson was also sent by Corais to Edward Everett, then at Harvard, who was also an editor of the North American Review. Everett ensured that the appeal was printed not just in his paper, but distributed throughout the United States. The result was a wide-ranging appeal by Americans to the cause of a people trying to assert their independence. Little was done in the halls of Congress during 1821 into 1822, aside from speeches of support made for the congressional record, including a letter of sympathy by President James Monroe. Private citizens, however, were another story. This is when we see the mobilization of the American public in the formation of these Greek committees, not just in the three major cities already mentioned, but throughout the United States and even into the South, where the committees operated with less fanfare and far less publicity so as not to incite the hopes of freedom among the slave Negro population. There were fundraising balls, there were auctions, and donations solicited in public and in churches. Colleges and universities participated in fundraising to the extent that was possible for the students. Laborers gave up a day's wages. Ship owners donated cargo space to convey material goods. And even school children collected pennies for their part. Some examples of funds raised. At Yale and West Point, students raised the sum of $500, which in today's money would be roughly about $13,500. The New York Committee raised $32,000, which today would be $900,000. This was done in May of 1824, and by December of the same year, the New York Committee had raised an additional 8,000 pounds sterling, which translates to over 1.2 million in present U.S. dollars. There were also American Philhellenes. Some of these names are familiar, and while their background and significance might be more obscure, their contributions to the Greek cause was significant. Edward Everett, an American diplomat. Daniel Webster, the famous American lawyer and statesman. Samuel Gridley Howe, an American Harvard-educated physician, an abolitionist, advocate for the education of the blind, and philanthropist. George Jarvis, a New Yorker who was in Europe at the time of the outbreak of the Greek War. He served in the Greek military, became a lieutenant general, and gained a reputation of being the most dedicated of the foreigners to fight alongside the Greeks. He, like Samuel Gridley Howe, was inspired by Lord Byron and later Byron's demise, and they both dedicated much of their lives to the Greek cause. George Wilson of Providence, Rhode Island. He was a gunner in the Greek fleet and saw action against the Turkish navy at the Battle of Lepanto. James Williams was a runaway slave from Baltimore who crossed the Atlantic to join the Greek navy. He enlisted as a cook initially in the Greek navy under Lord Cochrane, but later saw action in several engagements, including also the Battle of Lepanto. Jonathan P. Miller was from Randolph, Vermont. He was a former non-commissioned officer in the U.S. Army and a veteran of the War of 1812. His efforts, transport, and necessary supplies were funded by the Boston Committee. Not only was he a courageous soldier, but he was also an instructor of military affairs whose knowledge made a huge difference in his Greek company. He left the Greek army in 1827, having earned the rank of colonel, returned to Boston, and became the Boston Committee's principal agent in the distribution of material relief supplies. I would also like to point out that the American press became very interested in the Greek cause. The headlines of the time reveal that the Greek rebellion, or the Greek insurrection, as it was referred to then, was of broader interest, both in the North and in the South. Some of the following mastheads are from Georgia, Alabama, and South Carolina. You can see pictured here the Cherokee Phoenix from North Georgia, the Charleston Courier and Charleston Mercury, both from South Carolina, the Democrat from Alabama. Philadelphia, New York, Boston, and New England in general are very well represented too. The National Gazette from Philadelphia, the Buffalo Emporium and General Advertiser from Buffalo, New York, the Hartford Courant from Hartford, Connecticut, the Torchlight and Public Advertiser from Hagerstown, Maryland. And even less populated places around the country had headlines dealing with the Greek War of Independence. The North Star and Vermont Aurora, both from Vermont. So with all this interest, why was there no more active or forceful role by the United States? At least officially, there were numerous issues for the young republic to contend with, some of which we've already mentioned earlier in this presentation. The American nation was still heavily in debt, not only from the Revolutionary War and the War of 1812, but also from the previous 2 decades, having fought 2 wars in the Mediterranean. These were the Barbary Wars of 1801 to 1805, and again from 1815 to 1816. And they weighed heavily on the administrations of Jefferson, Madison, and Monroe. There were also efforts to establish trade with the Ottoman Empire, primarily in sugar, cotton, mocha, and Java, but also in indigo from the Caribbean. And then there was the complication of the Monroe Doctrine. If Monroe were to keep Europe out of the Western Hemisphere, he would not have good footing if he were to enter into the Eastern Hemisphere, even if it was in defense of the Greeks. Lastly, there is George Washington's farewell address. In 1797, at the end of his tenure as president, George Washington, in his farewell address, had advised the fledgling nation to take advantage of its isolated position and avoid foreign entanglements. There is, in fact, a stronger or perhaps broader legacy that the Greek War for Independence imparted on the American nation. Americans literally rescued families and individuals and brought them to the United States, especially after the massacres of Missolonghi and Chios. There are stories of survivors who were adopted, especially children. The most famous example is Lucas Miltiades Miller, who was adopted by Jonathan P. Miller in 1828. Brought to the United States, this man was educated, he studied law, and became the first Greek-American congressman representing the state of Wisconsin. The U.S. finally recognized officially the state of Greece, the independent nation of Greece, in 1833. And finally, the Greek War of Independence had an even longer and more far-reaching effect and a broader meaning to the world than just the formation of the Greek state. Well into the 19th century, the comparisons with the enslaved Greeks under Ottoman rule were recalled in the arguments for various liberation movements, including abolition, women's rights, and the suffrage movements. I hope that this presentation has illuminated some aspects which are not typically part of the general conversation about the Greek War of Independence. Thank you for your time.